I mean, your narrative, Mohammed, is not accepted at all by the U.S. mainstream media. And then at the same time, people in the United States have to remember that everything that they've ever heard about the Middle East has been pretty much premised on a fabrication.
I think if we go back to 1982, when the Israeli regime invaded Lebanon, regardless of the fact that there was no Hezbollah back then, so Israeli aggression goes back decades, aggression against Lebanon. They took the capital, Beirut. They committed the Sabra and Shatila massacre, killing almost 4,000 Palestinians in 36 hours with their Christian right-wing militia allies in Lebanon, which still exists today and who are very close to Western embassies. So genocide is nothing new to the Israeli regime. But in 1982, it took them roughly 5 days to get to Beirut. Now, the offensive has been going on for quite a while now, and they have yet to take a village in southern Lebanon.
Today, we're talking once again with Professor Mohammad Marandi to get his insight on the Middle East and what's happening inside of Iran. Mohammad is an expert on American studies and a teacher, a professor at the University of Tehran. Mohammad, welcome back.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
The news right now, Mohammad, is that Yoav Gallant, the defense minister of Israel, who has met with Lloyd Austin 80 times. We've just learned this, 80 times in the last year. That's, multiple times per week. Canceled the visit to meet with President Biden this week because Netanyahu insisted that he cancel the visit until Biden talks to Netanyahu himself, and presumably this is to agree upon a war plan directed against Iran. Anyway, I want to get your thoughts, if you have them, about what it means for Gallant's trip to be canceled. Does that have any relevance? What is Netanyahu and what are the Israelis planning? And what's the United States' position on this? In the last 24 hours, Mohammed, the United States, which had earlier insisted that it wanted a 21-day ceasefire in Lebanon, has retracted that and said, no, we're happy. We're cool with what the Israelis are doing. Anyway, a tense moment, obviously. What do you think? What's your assessment?
Well, as expected, and as I said earlier, after Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah was martyred, the Israelis have been beaten badly on the border with Lebanon. They tried to enter Lebanese territory on many occasions with heavy air support and artillery support, but they lost large numbers of troops, and the casualties among the Hezbollah soldiers in the south are much lower than Israel. And as I've said repeatedly, the tunnels that Hezbollah has are extensive. There are thousands of kilometers of tunnels in the south and central part of Lebanon, and also in parts of the north. And that murdering a number of officials or military officials in Beirut, which is the weakest link of Hezbollah, because Beirut is heavily infiltrated. It has always been heavily infiltrated by spies. Western embassies and NGOs have always been gathering intelligence for the Israeli regime, the Five Eyes, and many journalists. Obviously, they've been doing this for decades. So this is a more difficult place for Hezbollah to protect its assets and its information. But also under Beirut, because it's by the sea, the tunnel system is not like the rest under the ground in the rest of the country. Many of the tunnels go under mountains, and they're huge underground missile bases. They are very well protected. They're underground hospitals and other assets. So when they were gloating, the United States and the Europeans, after murdering Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, of course, they murdered him alongside hundreds of civilians who were in the 6 a tower, 6 towers, residential towers that were totally obliterated. I was roughly 1,000 meters from the explosion from the attack when it happened. They used 83, I've been told, 1-ton bunker busters. So they slaughtered all the women and children in those towers. And I know those towers. I've walked by them many times. I've driven by them because I lived in Beirut for my sabbatical for a year. So despite the slaughter, Western journalists and Western elites and Western diplomats, they were gloating. And the Israeli regime was gloating. But back then, I was telling Western journalists that Hezbollah will not be deterred. They will, in fact, grow stronger. And we've seen that. Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, his martyrdom has caused uproar across the region. It has made Hezbollah even more popular. And people across the region that until now were indifferent are suddenly paying attention. In Iraq, we see a lot of anger growing there. So the Israelis have failed. And I think that the regime is, for a year, they've been fighting and they've faced one dead end after another, one failure after another on the Lebanese border before this escalation, in Gaza, where they failed to capture this dot on the map, in the Red Sea, where the Americans couldn't do anything for them. And therefore, they need further escalation now. And of course, they want to attack the Iranians, not because they can win in any exchange with Iran, because Iran has already promised that if the Israeli regime escalates again, it will hammer it much harder next time and very swiftly. But the regime wants to bring in the Americans. That's basically my understanding of the situation. They want to escalate to bring in the Americans. Otherwise, an exchange with Iran would only lead to failure. The Israeli regime is small. Iran has a huge arsenal of drones and missiles, hundreds of thousands of each in underground cities across the country that were made after the United States invaded Iraq and Afghanistan. They were made to defend the country against the United States. So Iran has more than enough to devastate the regime. So these meetings, I think, are on the one hand to get more U.S. support, but I also think that there is probably a lot of tension behind the scenes. The American government, the regime in Washington, does not want to lose the election, and if the war escalates, that could change things. If the Americans enter the war, I think that would probably lead to Kamala Harris losing the election, because if they strike the Iranians will devastate their bases in the Persian Gulf, and those Arab family dictatorships in the Persian Gulf will be swept away because they'll be seen as hostile. And in Iraq, the resistance will overrun the American bases and expel all Americans from the country. And that would lead to a global economic meltdown, worse than 1929, something that will affect all of us probably for decades to come. And therefore, I think the Americans are desperate not to let this happen, but Netanyahu is desperate to have this happen. So I think between now and election day, many things can happen.
Yeah. You know, your narrative is almost 180 degrees different from what people are getting in the U.S. media. What people in the U.S. media are getting is that Hezbollah is now a headless organization, that there have been these military achievements by the state of Israel, that Hamas is degraded in Gaza, that the invasion of Lebanon is imposing huge losses for the Lebanese resistance. I mean, it's really 180 degrees different. And the way the U.S. media is talking about Gallant's visit being canceled for the time being is that Netanyahu just needs to make sure the Americans are on the same page before Gallant comes so that the strikes against Iran will happen. In other words, Israel is winning, the resistance is losing, Iran is on not its last legs, but it's the so-called axis of resistance, not so-called, but what the U.S. media, how the U.S. media portrays it, the axis of resistance is basically degraded. Iran standing in the Middle East is weak. I mean, your narrative, Mohammed, is not accepted at all by the U.S. mainstream media. And then at the same time, people in the United States have to remember that everything that they've ever heard about the Middle East has been pretty much premised on a fabrication. Why did the U.S. have to go to war against Iraq? Why did the U.S. have to go to war against Libya? The certainty with which the U.S. media announced that the Assad government in Syria was sure to fall just as the Gaddafi government had fallen in 2011. So anyway, I mean, it's really a remarkable difference of perspective. Is your perspective basically accepted also within the body politic in Lebanon or within Iran? I want to talk about that. And then I want to come back to you with it after we play a short clip. It's Kamala Harris basically sounding like she's ready to go to war with Iran. Anyway, I want to get your follow-up thoughts if I could.
Which foreign country do you consider to be our greatest adversary?
I think there's an obvious one in mind, which is Iran. Iran has American blood on their hands, okay? This attack on Israel, 200 ballistic missiles. What we need to do to ensure that Iran never achieves the ability to be a nuclear power, that is one of my highest priorities.
So if you have proof that Iran is building a nuclear weapon, would you take military action?
I'm not going to talk about hypotheticals at this moment.
Mohammed, there's a lot there. You know, the U.S. has thousands and thousands, really tens of thousands of nuclear weapons. It's the only country in the world that ever used nuclear weapons. They used them against civilian cities in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. But anyway, aside from the hubris and the arrogance and the warmongering, I want to get your take on things.
Well, Brian, I think if we go back to 1982, when the Israeli regime invaded Lebanon, regardless of the fact that there was no Hezbollah back then, so Israeli aggression goes back decades, aggression against Lebanon. They took the capital, Beirut. They committed the Sabra and Shatila massacre, killing almost 4,000 Palestinians in 36 hours with their Christian right-wing militia allies in Lebanon, which still exist today and who are very close to Western embassies. So genocide is nothing new to the Israeli regime. But in 1982, it took them roughly 5 days to get to Beirut. Now, the offensive has been going on for quite a while now, and they have yet to take a village in southern Lebanon. And the casualty figures are high. And live footage comes out of Lebanon from local media of Israeli tanks burning, Israeli soldiers being taken away by injured and dead soldiers taken by helicopter. So it's very difficult to pretend that the Israelis have had, the regime has had any success. While in the West, the media is basically shutting out information for the public, the people in the region are seeing what's happening. During the initial days after the murder of and martyrdom of Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, there was a lot of concern among ordinary people, but they were still determined. I was in Beirut, as I said, when he was martyred. I was there during the first few days when the fighting, the fighting began. The only success of the Israeli regime has been bombing apartment towers and slaughtering ordinary people. That's their only success. And the West is, of course, helping them do that. The EU is helping them do that. The Americans, the Canadians, they're all helping them because they're providing the regime with political cover to get away with crimes against humanity. The photo that you're just now showing, these are a tower. These are apartment blocks. People lived in them, and now they're under the rubble. People are buried there. I think actually that's the place I visited. I'm not quite sure, but after one of the bombings, we visited a site where the smoke was still rising, and it was so upsetting because I was wondering to myself whether there are people underneath who are shouting for help. I couldn't hear anything, but I kept thinking about it. But the West doesn't care. The Western journalists, they don't care. The legacy media journalists, they call these Hezbollah strongholds in order to dehumanize people and to help the Israelis carry out these atrocities. Just like the lies that we saw on October the 7th, when they lied about rape, when they lied about beheadings, when they lied about cooking children or baking children or whatever. They did that in order to help the Israeli regime carry out genocide. So these journalists are foot soldiers for a genocidal army. And in Lebanon, they're doing the same. But propaganda can only go so far. The question that people have to ask themselves is that if the Israelis have succeeded, then where are they on the map right now in Lebanon? Where are they? Have they advanced to Sur or Sayda, or where have they captured? And then all they have to do is go to a map, and even Wikipedia, which is a CIA linked asset, but if they go to Wikipedia and look at the events of the 1982 war, they'll see the complete different situation. If the regime is so strong, and if Hamas is beaten back and destroyed, then why can't the Israeli regime take Gaza? Why have they pulled? They've pulled back, and in a couple of areas in Gaza, they've occupied 2 areas in Gaza, and they just slaughter people as they've been doing over the last year. So no, the Israelis have failed. They will continue to fail, and the Americans should be careful. Ordinary Americans should beware, because if the Israeli regime doesn't care about the United States, it doesn't care about the United States or the Europeans. I mean, when they weaponized electronic products, they basically they destroyed Western brands, because people across our region are going to beware about buying iPhones or anything produced by Taiwan or Korea or Samsung phones or laptops in future, because the Israelis have been allowed to infiltrate supply chains. When a regime is allowed to do that and to harm Western brands, that shows they don't care about the West. The Israeli regime wants the United States to get into a fight with Iran, a fight that the Americans can't win. No one can win. Everyone will lose. It would be a lose-lose situation for everyone, because, as I said earlier, there's a balance of terror between Iran and the United States. If there is a battle, there will be no more oil or gas coming from this region, from the Persian Gulf region or Iraq or anywhere else. The American economy will collapse, and millions of people, tens of millions of people across the world will be on the move. So the Israelis are fine with that. If it helps them preserve their apartheid regime, their ethno-supremacist regime, so be it. But I think ordinary Americans should be aware that the political establishment doesn't behave too foolishly.
Let's go back again for our audience who may not have been paying attention to the Middle East in the early part of 2020. General Soleimani, an important top figure of the Iranian military. I think we have some B-roll where people can sort of see his image. He came to Baghdad airport, I think it was January 3rd, 2020. He came for peace talks. Donald Trump was then president of the United States. He got out of the plane, he got into a car, and then a US drone like murdered him and murdered the other people in the car, just blew it up. in an airport. They just blew it up. And at that time, the Iranians said, "Look, we're gonna retaliate for sure." And in the United States, Mohammed, we started organizing demonstrations. We had tens of thousands of people actually on January 5th in Washington, D.C. and 70 other cities, because it really looked like the U.S. was going to have a big war with Iran at that time, or certainly there was the danger of it. And the Iranians, well, if it wasn't Iran, it was forces that were certainly opposed to U.S. occupation in the Middle East, started striking U.S. military bases in Iraq. And all of the U.S. air defenses were penetrated. Every base that was targeted was struck. It still seemed like a somewhat measured attack because there weren't a lot of U.S. casualties, but there were a lot of U.S. injuries, a lot of U.S. brain injuries, et cetera, et cetera. And basically, Iran said to the Trump administration, okay, the ball is in your court. We've just demonstrated that we can hit your bases in Iraq. If we want to, we can kill a lot of American soldiers. The fact that there's not a lot of American soldiers who are dead is, if anything, a decision on our part to have a measured response, but one that sends a clear message that we can strike. And so everybody was waiting. There was like everybody was on the edge of their seat. What would Trump do? And Trump didn't do anything. There was no counter retaliation for Iran's retaliation. Wisely, the Trump administration stepped back. If they had not stepped back, Mohammed, we would have had full-scale regional and perhaps even greater than regional war. Everybody who pays attention to history knows World War I, which began in 1914, was preceded by the Balkans Wars of 1912 and 1913, and nobody thought in 1914 that World War I was going to be a world war, that 20 million people would die. All of that happened as a consequence of blunders, mistakes, unanticipated events, relationships that were not properly understood. In other words, a dynamic moment. Trump in 2020 and his team stood a step back. We're in the same situation. Iran has now hit Israel with at least 180 missiles in retaliation for the killing of Nasrallah and Ismail Haniyeh, who was visiting Iran as a guest of Iran, visiting while Iran's new president was being inaugurated. So Iran hit back at Israel. And last time in 2020, the U.S. didn't hit back. But if Israel hits back, this is what you're saying, Mohammed, is that we are on the cusp of a bigger, wider war. And Israel is for it. I want you to explain why Israel would be for it and why the U.S., even though it's sort of talking tough, has to be very, very wary about the dangers here.
Well, first, I have to remind your audience that there have been many provocations by the Americans and the Israelis. One was the murder of General Soleimani, where they murdered him as he was going to Baghdad at the invitation of the Iraqi prime minister, who wanted to discuss with him a letter from Saudi Arabia about rapprochement and easing tensions. So he went to Baghdad. He was leaving the airport. They were in two cars, and he was with the commander of the Iraqis who was leading the fight against ISIS. So these two gentlemen, the Iraqi and the Iranian, they were leading the fight against ISIS, and the Americans murdered them. He was going to be 7-8 hours later at 8 in the morning, I think. He was to meet the prime minister of Iraq to discuss improving relations with Saudi Arabia. So the Americans murdered him because he had defeated ISIS. And the Americans, of course, had supported ISIS. They helped create ISIS. And also the Americans did not want rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. But also, if we go back, we should remember that the first offensive act against Iran was carried out actually by the Americans and the Israelis when they carried out a cyber attack against Iran's nuclear program many years ago. And then the Israelis, with American help and the help of Western intelligence agencies, especially the MEK terror organization, the terror cult that has bases across Europe, and one big one in particular in Albania. They started to assassinate a number of Iranian scientists. One of them was a colleague of mine at the University of Tehran who was murdered in front of his wife. Then they murdered the deputy minister of defense. So the Israelis have carried out many provocations. Then in April, when they bombed the Iranian embassy, the United States and Western governments supported them at the UN Security Council. So they supported the bombing of an embassy, and then they condemned Iran for retaliating. And at that time, the Iranians carried out a limited retaliation. It was to gather intelligence, but also to force the Americans and the Israelis to show their hands. Instead of learning their lesson, the Americans and the Israelis, they saw this as a sign of weakness. And this time around, after again, another escalation by murdering Martyr Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, who was there, as you pointed out, at the invitation of the president, and in an official government guest house, the Iranians felt that they had to hit back much harder so that the Israelis would understand that Iran is dead serious. So now we're waiting to see what the Israeli regime does. But the Iranians have already promised that if the Israelis strike, Iran is going to strike much harder this time. In other words, the 200 missiles or 200 or so missiles that we saw last week, it'll be much worse than that. And the Iranians have yet to use their hypersonic missiles or their most advanced missiles, because they don't want to show, they want to keep their secrets for whatever, for when the day comes when they need to use their best missiles to destroy Israeli infrastructure. So this is where we are right now. We are at a very dangerous point. The Israeli regime has been humiliated by the Iranians because, in April they were saying we've stopped all the drones, but these were missiles and they almost all got through. And on the other hand, as I pointed out, on the border, they've been badly beaten by Hezbollah and their tunnel systems across southern Lebanon. So we're going to have to wait and see. But the Iranians are not going to, that the era of strategic patience is over for Iran. And the Americans have to recognize that Iran is not going to be intimidated. And Iranian key assets, by the way, are well protected. It's not as if the Americans can, or especially the Israelis can destroy Iran's nuclear program. Iran's peaceful nuclear program is deep underground. It was built to protect it from American airstrikes, which are far more capable than the Americans are far more capable than the Israelis. And also, I think they have to keep in mind that if they do strike the nuclear program, then Iran will leave the NPT. And the advisor to the leader, Dr. Kharazi, said twice that Iran may change its nuclear posture. And there isn't anything that the Americans can do about it. They can scream and yell and threaten and behave in arrogance, but they know quite well that they're in no position to fight a war with Iran. It's not a war that they will be able to win.
There's a lot there, Mohammed. Again, for people who might not know what the NPT is, the 1969 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was basically a quid pro quo between nuclear powers, governments that already had nuclear weapons, and governments that did not yet have nuclear weapons. And the quid pro quo was something like this. We, the nuclear powers, won't continue to build. In fact, we'll start to diminish and gradually eliminate our nuclear weapons in exchange for you, the countries that are not yet nuclear powers, not acquiring nuclear weapons. And Iran is a signatory to that deal. Now, the U.S. is obviously in violation of the NPT. The U.S. is not only building more nuclear weapons. Under Obama, they started a fourth generation of nuclear weapons. So on one level, the countries that pledged not to get nuclear weapons would have sort of a legal reason to say, well, look, the quid pro quo doesn't really exist. We're going to build nuclear weapons. Iran has not done that yet. Iran has, in fact, said, we don't want nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are evil. They should be gotten rid of. They're fundamentally a war crime. They can't distinguish between combatants and civilians. But we, Iran, don't have them. But as you're saying, and I think this is so important, the NPT, the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, does build into the treaty the right of a member signatory to withdraw from the NPT and say, in the name of our own national self-defense, we must acquire nuclear weapons. That's what North Korea decided to do after George W. Bush labeled North Korea, Iran, and Iraq an axis of evil on the eve of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And so North Korea said, okay, well, we're not going to be Iraq. We're getting nuclear weapons. And now they're a nuclear power. Iran hasn't done that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I also want to point something out as well that I think is very important. I don't follow American news channels, and I do read American media to a degree. But one thing I think Americans should recognize, because their Iran pundits are almost universally, I mean, almost all of them are fools. They are people who work in think tanks. They're paid to say what they say. They'll say what the elites want them to hear. They'll say what the people who fund them want them to say. And so they come on TV and talk nonsense day and night on CNN, MSNBC, ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox News. It doesn't matter. I could name them, but they're not even worth discussing. So the Americans are basically talking to themselves about Iran. And they say how the regime, as they like to call it, is unpopular and people want to overthrow it, and that it's about to implode. If anyone has been monitoring the Friday prayers last week, they will have learned a great deal about Iran. It took place, of course, early in the morning in the United States, so many people were asleep, but I would advise your viewers to watch the Friday prayers, and the translation of it online. Ayatollah Khamenei declared a few days before Friday prayers that he's going to lead the prayers, and he hasn't done that for a number of years. And this was at a time when there was a lot of online chatter that the Israeli regime wants to strike Tehran. And the Western media was saying, they say that these Iranian sources, unnamed Iranian officials, that they've moved the leader out of his office or residence for protection, and that sort of nonsense. Whenever the Western media, by the way, says unnamed Iranian officials, that means they're lying. It's just fabrication. Whenever you see it, or unnamed Hezbollah officials, that means they're lying. They're just making it up. But these are scenes of. I was at the Friday prayers. I was kilometers away from where you see right now these pictures. There were millions of people there. It was unprecedented. People, since they thought that the prayers were going to be attacked, they went to the prayers. And the leader, he went to the prayers. Not only did he go to the prayers, he went an hour earlier and held a ceremony for the martyrdom of Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah. Then he led the prayers, and then he stayed there to greet people. It was a show of force. So you had millions of people, millions of Iranians going to these prayers under circumstances which were unclear. People were prepared for airstrikes. They were prepared for drone strikes. And there were anti-aircraft missile systems that you could see on the hilltops around the place of prayer. The Islamic Republic of Iran has a high degree of legitimacy. And the Islamic Republic of Iran is fully prepared to defend itself. And the Americans have much more to lose than Iran does in any conflict. Because if the global economy collapses, we've been under sanctions for decades. Our lives will be more difficult, without a doubt. But the United States, it will fall much harder. And therefore, the biggest loser would be the United States. So when these American officials listen to these foolish Iranians or these these pundits that they're not really Iranian. They went to the United States. Some of them don't even speak proper Persian. Some of them haven't been in Iran for decades, and all of them are basically mercenaries. Almost every single one of them are mercenaries who say what needs to be said because that's what the think tanks that pay them want them to say. And those think tanks are linked to the corridors of power. So the Americans are deceiving themselves if they think that Iran is about to implode, that if Iran is weak, if people don't support the Islamic Republic. I don't think Trump, Trump who always brags about his crowds, he can never muster anything a fraction of the crowd that we saw in Friday prayers. And people who were prepared for strikes on, on them, and political leaders who were in the front were prepared to be hit by drones and missiles. So I think it was a show of force, and I think a lesson should be learned by the Americans that Iran is prepared. Iran doesn't want a regional war. No one wants a regional war. The only entity that wants a regional war is the Israeli regime. And they don't want to fight the war themselves. They want the Americans and the Europeans to fight the war for them, just like in the Red Sea. So the American people have to recognize that the Israelis are willing to sacrifice them, but they should also recognize that the Iranians are the power, the superpower in West Asia. And the Iranians have been preparing to defend themselves against a potential American attack for 2 decades now, ever since the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. The United States, which is declining economically, which is divided internally, which is losing the war in Ukraine, and which is losing the economic war with China, is only going to make things much worse for itself by increasing tensions with Iran, let
Well, we're
alone
talking,
engaging
Mohammed.
in some war.
Thank you. While we're talking, Mohammed, the Iranian foreign minister, as I understand it, is visiting his counterpart in Saudi Arabia. Now, given the fact that the Saudis have been a reliable ally / proxy for American power in the Middle East for a long time, I can remember myself after Iran had its People's Revolution in 1979, Ronald Reagan, about a year and a half later, said, "Oh, we will never let Saudi Arabia have a revolution," as if it was up to him. Anyway, there was a long-standing, close relationship between the U.S. and Saudis, and still is, and a long-standing confrontation between the new Iranian government and the Saudi government. And yet here we are on the eve of what you said is a possible Israeli-inspired, Israeli-induced regional war against Iran. Iran's foreign minister is being welcomed in Saudi Arabia. Let's talk about what that means from your point of view.
Well, it is another failure of the United States. Their whole model for the region has been to rule and to keep the region divided. And as the United States grows weaker, and it is growing weaker very rapidly, much more rapidly than we anticipated, largely because of economic policies, but also the endless wars, and now the war in Ukraine is really draining the resources and the capabilities of Europe and the United States. Europe, in particular, is falling very fast. So the United States, its ability to manipulate as in the past is much more difficult, whereas its need for manipulation is much greater today because the United States is weaker than before. Now, the United States, as we discussed earlier, tried to keep Iran and Saudi Arabia divided by murdering General Soleimani. But then we saw how the Iranians and the Saudis were able to put aside many of their differences The Chinese also played a part in reestablishing ties between the two. So this is just another symbol of American decline and how the Americans are failing to build a united front against Iran as they did in the past. And we have to remember that the ongoing genocide in Gaza, uh, this is being watched across the world and across the region every day. So while American legacy media supports this genocide and what many call a Holocaust, because the numbers that are really dead are far greater than the official numbers. There are tens of thousands of people under the rubble, tens of thousands of people who died of disease and cancer and all sorts of other complications as a result of what the Israelis did to Gaza. And now the genocidal strikes in Lebanon. These are things that people across the region and across the world are seeing. It's across the global south in particular. And it resonates among people across the global south. I mean, when they watch these scenes, they see their own history. They see the history of colonialism. They see the history of empire. They see the scenes in front of them as a repetition of what they read in their history books, whether in different parts of Africa or Latin America or Asia. And that intensifies the anger and the outrage and the disgust that's directed towards the West. And the West has demolished its soft power capabilities as a result. Its image has been completely destroyed alongside that of Israel because the West is genocidal. The West, they can, CNN and MSNBC can justify these horrific acts all they want, or try to twist the narrative, or try to distort the reality all they want, but people are seeing these. And even in the West, the mood has shifted, and people are viewing the Israeli regime and Western regimes differently than before. So in future, the West is never going to be able to talk about human rights in Russia or China or even North Korea, because everyone is seeing what they've been doing for well over a year. So while the United States is militarily not in a position to fight Iran, the United States is also completely discredited outside of the United States. People in our region, inside Saudi Arabia, public opinion is extremely hostile towards Israel. In Jordan, in Egypt, across the region, people are outraged. So does the United States really think that if they intensify a war where they cannot win, that this is going to make things better for them across the region? The uproar, we've already reached the boiling point. And they should recall how a little over a decade ago, a young man in Tunisia burned himself alive over a personal grievance, and that the whole region exploded, and the government of Egypt fell. The closest U.S. ally after the Israeli regime, or one of the closest, it just collapsed. Now it's far more dangerous for the United States and the West. So they are playing with fire. They cannot control the situation anymore. They're much too weak, and the region is gradually tilting away from them, not because necessarily certain pro-Western Arab dictatorships want to be independent from the West. It's because they see that the West no longer can provide their family dictatorships the protection that they want from them. So they have to seek friendship with Iran, with Russia, with China. And as we move forward, I think this is only going to increase.
The Iranian people had a revolution in 1979, Mohammed. That's when the U.S. broke diplomatic relations. Since then, for these past 40 plus years, there's been sanctions, economic warfare against the people of Iran. Before that, Iran had been the target of the CIA and British intelligence after the government in Iran between 1950 and 53, a democratically elected government, dared to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, AIOC, or we call it now BP. But the government said, let's use these oil revenues to alleviate poverty in Iran rather than to fatten oil executives in London or Wall Street. And for that sin, the U.S. carried out economic sanctions, a destabilization. It led to a coup d'etat, and it restored a monarch, a dictator, to the throne in Iran. At that time, I want to read something. I just pulled it up from my phone. We see a picture of Jimmy Carter standing with the Shah, who was brought to the power in 1953. And he leaves power only when the Iranian people rise up. And then Carter foolishly brought him to the United States for, quote, medical treatment. But here's what the New York Times said, Mohammed, after the U.S. and the British intelligence carried out this bloody coup d'etat, restoring a dictator to the throne. This is what the New York Times said in 1954. Underdeveloped countries with rich resources now have an object lesson in the heavy cost that must be paid by one of their number, which goes berserk with fanatical nationalism. That's the New York Times boasting about the price that must be paid by third world developing countries that go berserk with nationalism, meaning nationalizing the assets that are being looted from their country by Western transnational corporations. I mean, I think it's so important for the people of the United States because they're only hearing things about Iran, which are these negative, demonizing caricatures, where what we really see in Iran, as you can see in Saudi Arabia or Cuba or Venezuela or all over the world, it's really colonialism versus the people who no longer want to be colonized. And those people who no longer want to be colonized, some could be communists, some could be pan-Arabists, some could be nationalists, some could be Islamicists, but they all want to be free people. And I think it's so important for the American audience to realize that caricaturing the form of government in any of the anti-colonial governments is simply a whitewash of what the real issue is. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, I would also add, because I'm not sure, but I think the scene that you showed, or your colleagues showed, of the Shah and Carter may have been where Carter, the last time he saw the Shah before the revolution, he said that Iran was an island of stability. And we saw how wrong he was and how the U.S.-backed regime fell shortly afterwards. The Americans had no idea what was going on in Iranian society, despite having tens of thousands of military advisors and tens of thousands of other Americans working in Iran with very great, excellent salaries. They had no idea what was happening in the country. And I would argue that they have no idea what's going on in the Arab world either, in Arab countries. They say the Arab world wants to align itself with Israel, but they're only talking about these elites and dictatorships that engage with them. But the people on the streets despise the Israeli regime and they despise their own leaders. So the Americans should be very careful about pushing too hard, because we may have other countries in the region that overthrow, where the pro-American regimes may begin to grow unstable as a result of what's going on in Gaza and Lebanon and elsewhere. The United States is not the power that it was before, and the region is changing, the world is changing. So the more the Americans push, the more dangerous it becomes for them. And the Islamic Republic of Iran, after the revolution, that's what the Americans called Iran. They said it was a fanatical theocracy. They love, but they were saying that the same thing, as you pointed out, about Mossadegh in 1953. Now, when you look at the same New York Times, they praise Mossadegh, the same New York Times that attacked him back then and called him a fanatic. Now they praise him, but they attack the Islamic Republic of Iran and consider that to be fanatical. Because history is okay. You can be a bit more honest about history, but because it doesn't affect you so much, but you can continue. You should still be, the Western media will continue to be dishonest about today because they feel it's in their own interest. But the problem is that the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, MSNBC, the BBC, the Guardian, all of these outlets are misleading themselves and the elites in the West into thinking that their position is much stronger than it really is. The situation is not good for the West. It is very bad. The region is boiling. The Western media can pretend that the Israelis are the good guys, but people see that the Israeli regime is a monstrous regime that is thirsty for the blood for Amalek. They've seen the statements made by Israeli regime officials, from the prime minister who called the Palestinians Amalek, the president who said, and all of them are Europeans, and even the prime minister has changed his name. But these are people who came from Europe and now are governing over land that doesn't belong to them. But that aside, the president says that there are no innocents in Gaza. The Minister of Defense, or in reality, the Minister of Genocide, says it will cut off their water, will cut off their medicine, will cut off the food, will cut off the electricity for everyone. The intention of genocide was there. The act of genocide was carried out. People see this. The West can pretend, they can hide reality maybe for themselves, but they can't hide it from the rest of the world. So the reality on the ground has changed. The mood on the ground has changed. The West has grown much weaker. This is a very, I think, dangerous situation for the West. Things could fall apart for them quite easily. But again, I do think that there are enough sane people in the United States to recognize that the Americans cannot win a war against Iran. When Iran was much weaker in 2003 and during that era, the Americans never attacked Iran, even though they spoke about it, because they understood that Iran is not Iraq, it's not Afghanistan, it's not Libya, it's not even Vietnam. It's more than all of these combined. And the United States is not the United States of the 1960s or the 1970s or the 1990s. So people have to make a decision in the West. Do they want to close their eyes and allow Netanyahu to draw them towards or push them towards catastrophe, or do they want to push back and prevent the United States, and the rest of the world, from entering a catastrophic situation?
Those are very important points, Mohammed. I'm just going to close out here by also mentioning that at this moment, as the U.S. is on the cusp of a wider war with Iran, induced by, or the Israelis want to induce the U.S. to do it, you have another major hurricane devastating Florida. Right after Hurricane Helene, there's Hurricane Milton. I was just down there not too long ago. After Hurricane Helene and an earlier hurricane, Hurricane Ian, all the insurance companies are canceling people's flood insurance and wind insurance because it's no longer profitable for the insurance companies. So you have millions of Americans, some of them vote blue, some of them vote red, vote for Trump or vote for Kamala Harris. They're getting wiped out. And instead of paying attention to the needs of working class people in the United States who are being devastated by climate catastrophe and who are being abandoned by American institutions like the insurance companies and the banks, not to mention the politicians, the last thing the American people actually need is another war. Like to spend $1 trillion a year on so-called defense, which is just war, while the needs of average working class folks in America are left unattended. And climate catastrophe is no joke. It's growing. Anyway, people have to really, as you're saying, put on your thinking cap, think about where you want to spend your resources. Mohammed, I want to thank you so much for joining us. I know you're talking to us today from Istanbul. It's late there. But again, thank you so much for your insights and your analysis.
Thank you very much. I have a cold. I hope it hasn't affected my ability to convey my ideas too much. But one final point that I would like to point out is that the United States has lied about all of its wars in the past. It lied about Iraq. The United States supported Saddam Hussein. They, along with the Europeans, gave him chemical weapons. Then later on, they turned against him and, in the name of chemical weapons, attacked Iraq. The United States destroyed Libya. They destroyed so much of Syria. They destroyed Afghanistan. They destroyed so much of the region. And in every single case, the American people did not benefit. It only made things worse for ordinary Americans. We all see the economic decline of the United States. And now, as we speak, the war in Ukraine has not stopped. It continues and it will continue. Trump and Harris, they're the same. For Iran, they don't make a difference at all. They are two preachers of the deep state, of the political establishment. One may be a bit more rogue in certain aspects, and the other more obedient in certain respects, but they're basically the same. The American people have to start thinking more seriously about their fate. They do not live in a democracy. They do not have a media that is open to real debate. As I said, when it comes to Iran, for example, all they do is invite people who are spinning the narrative of the political establishment. It doesn't matter if it's Fox News anymore, MSNBC. It doesn't matter. There's no difference between the Guardian and the Times. They're all the same now. It's much worse than it was even 40 years ago. It's much worse than when Chomsky wrote Manufactured Consent. Back then, it was not good. Now, when you look in the past, it was infinitely better than it is today. So I think really the only way forward is for people to recognize that the political regime is not going to spare them. It is only going to make things worse for them. It is completely indifferent to their fate, as you pointed out the catastrophes that many people in the South and in the South east of the United States are facing today because of the hurricanes. There's no money for them, but there's money for war in Ukraine. There's money to commit genocide in Gaza. There's money to commit genocide in Lebanon. But there's no money to help the homeless people and the people whose lives are being destroyed in the United States and whose schools are falling apart and whose communities are falling apart. And if this continues, I think that the United States is going to face a catastrophic situation at home. And again, I doubt that the United States will enter conflict with Iran. But if that happens, I think that people should look at the history books and look at 1929 and see what happened. It will be much worse than that.
All right, we're going to leave it right there. Mohammad Marandi, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.